Thank you. First, let me introduce a little bit myself. I guess I need to. Where does it click? Okay, good. Okay. So I'm with Digital. I'm a senior consultant, and my focus area is architecture, risk analysis, and security architecture. I've done quite a few clients. I help them establish, architecture practice and doing a risk assessment with them. And then so along the way, I've been thinking about what does it mean by security architecture, and then company begin to wake up to the reality that they need somebody on the architecture side to cover, the life cycle. And then there are various ways to do it, and I've seen quite a few variety, and then I've put in a lot of thought about that. So I want to share with everybody, what I observe and what I think about in this regard. So,
I think resolutions are.
So the quick agenda is basically try to. I'm not going to be coming from the theoretical kind of what a security architecture is and things like that, because there's not really any significant literature speak to that, and security architecture means different thing to different people. Or from my perspective, I'm thinking about a security architect working with the development team. That's my focus. Okay, and then say if you have a project, you want some security architect to come in and help out. What does it mean? That's the problem I'm interested in. Okay, so security architecture, there are a lot of things on the net. I do a search. This is a typical security architecture, okay, which is very valid. It depends on your point of view. You have firewalls, you have routers, and then you need different guards in different places, okay. But if you give this to a development team, then they're clueless what to do, right? So the same thing, a lot of enterprise architecture folks would articulate architecture from the very top down, translate from organization governance, down to capability to architecture, the whole 9 yards, and then they arrive at this kind of diagram. And again, this is all relevant and then set a really good context, but it doesn't help development team. Okay. And then there are some point solutions, like this is very particular, specific architecture. The security manager and help you do a lot of the nitty-gritty techniques. So this is kind of relevant, and a lot of people actually do architecture security from this perspective. I call this point solution. The problem with this is, how do you translate the high-level security mandate from the organization down to this, and then how do you have certain level of assurance and coverage? Okay, this is nothing wrong. This is very relevant and very useful, but it's not going to be, when you're a security architect, you come in the project, the goal is to put the pieces together so it's secure. Okay, it's not a one-point solution where you point out some particular controls, which is very important, but it's not enough. So I've shown you quite a few, security architecture, and then the government, with the next 853 catalog of security controls, basically the way they do security architecture, from what I understand, is they create a handbook and articulate what is relevant in their domain, and then for particular project, they also have a subset that's more relevant to the particular project, and they implement those, and then it's like a checklist approach, and which is one way to do it, but there are problems with that. Basically, all it boils down to is if you do it right, everything is right, no matter how you do it. If you do it wrong, checklist is not going to help. So that's the problem. And then as a project team, you hire a security architect. What do you expect, right? So that's a question. And then from a practitioner perspective, now I'm hired as a security architect. When I come in, how do I articulate what I am supposed to do for you, right? So that is the question that always hangs in my mind. So when I think about this, I want to look at the overall, everything we do, there's an input, there's an output, and there's a process, right? So the input to a security architecture, if you think about it, it has policies, which is, ultimately the most important, the why and the what that you have to do, and as an organization. And then you have a lot of standards and procedures, and you in big organization, you have EA reference model and a lot of shared services that are made available. And then you could also have a pen testing result, SCR result, as part of your portfolio to manage as a security architect, because you need to know if you are not building a system from ground up and you are building a system like enhancer system or building components that work with existing system, then anything that's coming from security assessment, vulnerability assessment is going to be relevant, and then you would have to make sense of it, incorporate into your architecture as well. And then the application requirements, certainly has some influence on the security architecture. This is not a comprehensive list, but I just want to give you, a broader picture. When you add as a security architect coming into a team, development team, these are all the things you have to keep in mind. If you're missing any of this, it's hard to do it right. Okay. And then certainly as an architect, you are in a technical leadership position, so you need to figure out who you work with and who's your partner, and then from different partners, you actually need to talk to them differently. Business stakeholders, for example, they have concerns that you need to be able to translate and discern what is security related, what is not, and then also communicate back and then to validate that is the concern, right? System availability, what does it mean to system users? They don't know, right? And then if you ask them, but you will have to figure out based on the criticality of the transaction, the sensitivity of the data, everything together, and you say, does this make sense to you? So you will have to be able to communicate with the business stakeholder at that level. Okay. EA security is usually a major, driving force behind security architecture. They may mandate you to do it a certain way, and then there are certain things you have to use. For example, shared services, the whole enterprise should use this tool to protect password or something like that. And SSG group, the software security group, is certainly a very relevant group because they establish most of the security standards, and then they enhance this SDLC to provide security checkpoints. And the application team is your center of the universe when you do application development security. And certainly share service team that you use their service to protect your passwords or to manage database credentials or all kinds of controls. And the deployment team has a lot to do with your architecture as well. So as a security architect, when you come on the team or into a project, this is a list of people you need to be able to communicate to and translate the security requirement, the impact of things to all these partners. Okay, you can talk to development team. Certainly, you have to help them understand and then implement. But other stakeholders you would have to keep in mind as well. So then, since I looked into this and what it means to be a security architect, and then my point of view is more specific to a project team, and then I figure out there's no particular definition. If I go to Google and search security architect, there's no definition, not even Wikipedia. And then and I'm thinking, well, let's think about what makes sense. And one way to think about this is top down. Okay, I'm a security architect. I'm this stick. I come from I represent this organization, security organization, and then the policy, and I have to carry out the stick and make sure things works, right? But that kind of top down has a huge gap. How do you convey that, translate that into what developers can understand? Okay, that is like a 10,000-mile gap, and then it's very hard. You have to do it, step by step and fill in the gap. That is the major challenge. And then another way is a lot of companies actually hire security architects just based on this and say, okay, I have project team. I don't know. I kind of think I need security architecture support. Okay, I have some pen testing result. I have some source code review result, and then I need people to help me with how to remediate the issues, and then and whenever I have some security related question, I have somebody to help. Okay, that is pretty much the state of the art for most of the project team at the moment. Okay, and then that is a very useful thing to do. It's very valuable, but from security perspective, security is about secure the weakest link, right? So if you don't have a comprehensive picture, then you can do a lot of things to help, but it does not get you a secure posture. Okay, so that is the problem. That's where architecture, if the architect, as an architect, you feel proud about putting the pieces together and make sense, right? And then you want to make sure you not only work on only one piece, but the picture makes sense. That is, as far as I'm concerned, an architect's pride, basically. And then I think about another thing is, okay, what are the problems a security architect try to solve? Okay, and then I talk to a lot of people, and then it pretty much boils down to two questions. I build the right control, identify the right control, and then build it right. Okay, so those are the two questions, and then it's very succinct, because if you mix either one of it, things is gonna fall apart, right? If you build a wrong control, then you waste your effort. If you mix a control that you need, then all bets are off, basically. And then, but even if you identify the right control, you want to build it. If you build it improperly, so for example, some people try to build a crypto from ground up, and then that would be a major mistake, because it's very hard. And then, so build it right, and it's very important. So both are very important. So when I get into a team, I always use these two questions to checkpoint what I'm doing. And then, so when I review the overall security architecture, I would ask the first question: am I doing the right thing? And then it's comprehensive. And then when I drill down into individual control or components, I would ask the second question. Anything can anything go wrong? What are we doing it properly? Okay, so those are the two key questions I keep asking when I do security architecture.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So can you go back to the previous slide? So is there any process to find out what the right security control is, how do you get to that? How do you determine that this control is the right control? Because you have so many stakeholders. You have compliance, you have security business practices, you may have some other company-specific policies. So how do you arrive at that?
That's a very good question. And then so there are ways to identify that, and then basically to get to the right controls, there are two levels. One, you need to understand your requirement, right? So whatever is right, need to address whatever the business goal is, the requirement is, right? So you need to look at that. But the right control also have a technical aspect of it, and then you need to, as an architect, you need to understand in your toolbox the list of controls, and then from your experience, what control can do what. And then so it's a matching process. You have a set of requirements, and you know a set of controls, and then you match them. Okay, so that's a process. And then so you would need to understand the context, and then there's for example, when you do file exchange with an external partner, okay, what level of control is sufficient? Okay, it's certainly a secure channel, that makes sense, right? And then the question is integrity control, is it necessary? Okay, you need to understand the business context, right? And then do you even need non-repudiation, for example? You would need to talk to the business and see, what contractual agreement is in place, and then how, that translates into your level of strength. So the choosing the right control aspect is extremely important, but also depends a lot on the business requirement and also experience of the architect. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it depends a lot on the judgment of the architect.
Yes. It's a little bit of, it's science in the sense that you do want to have traceability, and you want to have references, right? But it's art in the sense that you have to observe all those information and make sense to match them. Okay, so that's why that's the fun of a security architect, but it's also a very hard thing to do properly.
Another question quickly. Like in the enterprise architecture, you got Zachman, Cubes, TOGAF, Federal Enterprise Architecture. They're basically different approaches to present it visually, right? Different dimensions of enterprise, different aspects. In security, you also get different dimensions, right? Different aspects of security, like security of the business process, security of financial controls, maybe transactional security, like FISCAM. You got some technical. So, you would have to ask these questions at different dimensions, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's not just like with one context. There are different contexts, different dimensions, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And another question: are there also different visual models for presenting the security architecture?
Well, I think in the EA area, security architecture model actually is more better defined, basically, better defined. And then they do address all those scenarios, and then they present a view, like you say, that is comprehensive, and then based on enterprise capabilities and requirements. But on the other hand, EA architecture usually covers a much broader scope, right? Because it's the whole enterprise or a lines of business at that level. You do EA security. And at the project level, basically, you deference your context to that. Use that as your mandate, as your reference model. But you drill down into the piece that's related to your application or system. And then you try to do your control for that piece in the context of, okay, we have monitoring, we have network security, we have the redundancy, we have everything, right? but that is your context from the EA. When you come to the project team, you focus more on the application itself and the environment, direct environment that is the application is going to run on. Okay, so this is one example that with the project I worked on so far I've tried to articulate, security architect, what's the concern, what's the focus, but there is a SDLC that's there for the project team, and then from deliverable and process perspective, how do you fit in? That's also a kind of procedural issue. You have to figure it out. And I'm going to talk about threat modeling a little bit from technique perspective. But the basic idea is if you look at the box in the middle, the security architecture design, that is the center of what a security architect can do. You build a threat model based on what's there. You address all the requirements from the policy, standard procedures, and the baseline that the company has. And most of the time, you will have some functional requirements from SDLC perspective, and then you have some non-functional requirements, right? Non-functional requirements, in my experience, very few of them are usable or trackable and implementable. Okay, they are very high level, but that depends on the company. Some company would have very detailed non-functional requirement that's technical, but a lot of company, especially when the size is big, the business people would tend to provide, what the non-functional requirement is, and then they provide in a way that is very high level. You can't really do design off that directly, but that is, again, whatever they put in non-functional requirement, you will have to make sense of it and make sure you can trace back whatever you do, trace back to those requirements.
Can you give an example, like when you say non-functional security non-functional requirement?
Security non-functional requirement, for example, you would have a data classification of public information, sensitive information, and highly restricted information, for example, and then that classify your data, right? And then so there are standard that says, anything that's sensitive and up need to be encrypted. Okay, so that is business can understand. Okay, that's protect and then encrypt. But from a architecture perspective, this data goes through many places in the database, right? Stored there, and then it can go through message queues, right? It can the core business logic engine will process that. Client could see that data, okay, and then you actually can exchange those data with your partner, okay. So, as a security architect, business requirement is that need to be protected, and then even tell you, need to be encrypted, okay, because that's significant enough from business perspective. But where to encrypt it and how to encrypt it properly, it becomes a very becomes a development issue, team issue. So does that answer your question? Okay. So the way to do this, I allude a little bit to the different places that you need to do something. That comes out of one of the techniques I use is to do threat model. Okay, you have a architecture, functional architecture, that you have all the pieces and all the connectivities and so you have the whole picture, and then you try to see where things can go wrong, where things can, various factors can attack you, attackers can attack you from different layers. You have insider attack, you have public attack, internet-based attack, you have intranet-based, and or you even have partner exchange can be subject to attack. So you do a threat model of the system and identify all the points that you need control on. So that is the key tools, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about to get to the comprehensive picture. Okay, so in the middle box, the security architecture, basically, I would like to identify this business context again, so I can, for anything that I ask the development team to build, I need to be able to translate that back to business and say why they need to put money in building this, right? So that is the link that you want to make sure you capture. And then the threat model is the center of digesting all the income knowledge and all the inputs you have. And then so you get to a model that you feel comprehensive. And you can also take it and explain to people, because you base your threat model on the functional architecture, which the development team understand, and business team can also kind of understand as well. So you lay on top of that your threat model, and then you can say, okay, this is where you do security controls, and then they can understand that, and then you can justify, and discuss from there, what is necessary, what level of strength is necessary. And then from there, since we have the control, then you can also derive a set of security requirements, because you need to build this, you need to do encryption on the message queue, for example, right? And then you need to, right there, you can translate that into security requirement that can be tracked through the development life cycle. Okay, and then so the security requirement would fit into the design when you design a solution, or the detailed design, so company call it. And then so in the testing phase, you can actually do testing on those requirements, verify whether they have been implemented or not. So this is just one pattern that I use, but it's really how things fit in really depends on the culture of the organization, and how the project team is organized in an organization. So you would have to figure that out and then see how things fit in, basically. Any other questions? And I just want to introduce a little bit of threat modeling as a tool for security architect. I describe, how it would help us to do security architecture, and this is one example. Say, again, when you do security architecture, you also want to break it down as well, because in a typical enterprise system, you would have, probably 4 to 10, functional components. You have a set of shared services you touch. You have file exchange, potentially you have messaging infrastructure, messaging queues, right? All those components, when they come down together, it's very hard to wrap your arm around that. So you will have to figure out a way to break it down, and then say, okay, for messaging, okay, this is the set of requirement. And then so you have a more manageable problem to solve. And certainly all the pieces eventually need to plug in with each other. But when you do threat modeling, you take a piece and you break it down and then see where things can be vulnerable, and then you prescribe what kind of control is effective for that purpose. And so in a threat model, usually you have the assets. You identify where your data is, where your sensitive information is, and then your basically anything you need to protect as assets. So you identify those and make sure whatever access connectivity to it has certain level of protection. And then you identify, based on the attack, various agents can attack your system in different way. And then you want to make sure you identify the potential attacks, and then see how to stop those with the controls. And this would require experience, but can be trained as well, because typical attack patterns exist. A lot of people see that again and again and again. It's not like it's something new, right? Certainly the 0 days are pretty new. And then I think from building application perspective, you're not going to be able to deal with 0 day. It needs another paradigm shift to handle that. But within the realm of what we know, that can be trained as well. Experiences. So it takes a lot of experience, but with proper training, you can also do threat modeling. So threat modeling is a key tool to get to a comprehensive picture that at least I feel comfortable with. Yes.
Question on the threat modeling side. A great presentation so far. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions around how an organization goes about conducting threat modeling in terms of? So, would you recommend taking a couple of days or a day? I know it also varies on the type of application, etc. But assuming you have all of the right players, would you recommend doing threat modeling staggered over a few sessions, or have a couple of solid sessions to go through the entire threat modeling exercise?
That's a very good question. Actually, so far there's very few organizations that have solved that problem. So as the scale up of the threat model, or even doing threat modeling at scale, I guess it's the same thing. Basically, if you think about it, do a one-off threat modeling is not a difficult thing, right? Certainly with proper training, but you roll out to an organization and maintain that posture. Okay, that's difficult. And then different methodology also, have a deep learning curve. For example, Microsoft threat modeling, right? So the scaling up is really a big problem. We try to solve for clients, and then I think it's very difficult. So when I think about this, the way I think about it is really short term is not going to work. You have to do long term. Just like anything, you have security baseline, right? So I threat model a reasonable approach based on what I understand is you would establish a baseline of threat model patterns, right? So then you pretty much cover any major components in the organization with the threat model that's well done. You don't want half-assed done, because that doesn't do you any good, right? And then once you've done it, the good thing is you only need to do it once, right? In a typical organization, you probably have 10 to 15 patterns. That's it. You do not have anything more than that. So it's not a huge amount. You have messaging, you have file exchange, you have database access, right? And then you have a web app, which comes with session management, all those things, right? So when you put all of them together, it's not a whole lot. But the key thing is you need to do it right. And the implication is organization also use a lot of technology solutions, right? So for authentication, you have 5 tools. You have AD, you have Oracle, whatever, right? So and then your pattern would need to reach to wherever you use. Basically, ideally, you want to get to a place where, as an organization, I have a project, new project I want to develop, and then my functional architecture has these 3 pieces, and then I can choose from a catalog that I trust that, if I do messaging, this is the pattern that's well established, and then the set of requirement is there. I just use it. I don't need to hire people to do threat modeling on my architecture, right? And then, but I need to know, I know exactly what I need to build. Okay, so in a mature, kind of a idealistic way, that was what I'm thinking about. And actually, I think it's very efficient if we do it that way, because you have a baseline and then you maintain that. And as the industry evolve and then new attack patterns come into place, you really need a centralized place where you can articulate how the new attack impact all my patterns. For example, if you were doing only the web app before, and now cloud comes in place, a lot of companies begin to struggle a little bit, because you don't know what's the implication. It's not that you don't know. People tell you a lot about the implication, but how do you implement it, deploy that into your architecture? That's a big problem, right? So if you have a baseline, then you have a picture you look at and you say, this, and this is going to need to be changed. Once it's changed, any system, they just need to react. They don't need to do the threat model. They don't need to do anything. So to me, a mature threat modeling approach is you establish the baseline, buy the bullet in the beginning. Okay, it's going to be multi-year effort. It's not, even though it's less than 20, 15 kind of patterns. It takes a lot of effort to do it right and then do it properly. And then once it's established, you have ownership to maintain it. And then if you have, say, typical organization, you have, close to 100 applications all the time, kind of ongoing, then you save a lot of energy. Okay, so you would reduce a lot of need for project team to hire, a security architect, to work constantly with the team. So the scale is a very tricky issue. You have to invest for the long term to get scale. Okay, there's no way around that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
So can you clarify how you use the word pattern? Like in this case, you use messages. Would it be like data flow? Or?
The pattern is, it's just a casual.
In this diagram, like it's message oriented.
Right.
Would it be data flow oriented or what? Records oriented.
In the threat model, by the way, pattern, I throw that word around a little bit loosely. Okay, it's not the design pattern kind of strict definition, but it is a recurring problem that has a common solution that you see again and again. Okay, in that sense, I actually do use the pattern in that way. You have, say, any organization, you deploy a messaging component, for example, then you would have this kind of surface you need to protect. And then it certainly depends on the tool or the way you implement it. There may be a more technical side of whether you build things or you just configure things, but the overall surface is the same. Okay, that to me is the pattern. It's a little bit more abstract than the concrete technology base. Attack surface is basically whatever is exposed in the system. For example,
right. I understand what I'm saying. You define it as pattern, right?
No, this whole thing is a pattern to me.
Oh, okay.
So for example, this threat model here, right? You have a queuing system, which usually is a messaging server, a MOM, and then you have clients, you have message store, you have config configuration data, and you have application client, application server, and then they exchange through the messaging infrastructure, right? So along the way, there are various places you could expose components.
So those red lines, those are attack vectors?
The lines are attack vectors. So anytime you have a communication link, anytime you store something, it's potentially subject to attack, right? It's just various way of getting in and attack it, right? So that's why doing threat modeling, again, it can be trained and it could be done kind of systematically, but on the other hand, you also need to be able to abstract the architecture, the functional architecture, and then lay on top of that to define your threat model. And then I also, capture kind of a process to do security requirement, and then, but this is just basic. You identify you interview people to identify, what's important, and then you look at the underlying architecture and break it down, and then you begin to build threat model. And once you have the threat model, then you can derive security requirements of that. Because in the threat model, what you eventually have is the security controls that can protect, your asset against the attack. And then those controls will become the center of your requirements. Okay. And then it's the scale problem that we talked about. Basically, establishing a baseline. It's a mature way to do it. And then, organizations always start with doing something, and then try to scale up, and then see how it goes, and then it becomes very difficult to hire, people, and then to do it properly, and then you begin to rethink about the overall approach, and then eventually you will get mature. I mean, that's a process organizations need to go through anyway, just for, like any complex problem you need to solve. So this is actually not uncommon. But when I think about the maturity of a security architecture, this is as far as I can go. I can come up with, establish a baseline, and then patterns are well established in an organization, and you have a set of control for a pattern, and then you have a set of requirements that can track through your life cycle. And better yet, because when you introduce a tool, for example, to do password protection, a significant subset of the requirement has already been, implemented in a shared service. And then so what comes down to the development team is going to be a small subset, and that's what we hope, right? And then the pattern also help strategically where you spend your money, right? To introduce point solution to address certain critical patterns. And then another thing is, okay, I have 1,000 apps, ongoing or already in production, and I need to look through them, and because new attack keep coming up, and then I still need to retrofit some of the control, or at least need to understand what the risks are, right? So that is also a huge undertaking. A lot of organizations try to do, right? People just scratch the surface on that. And so there are ways to do in terms of using a tool. For example, for critical systems or applications, you want to do really in-depth and then full coverage, right? But for not too critical applications, you can actually do a kind of breadth-based approach rather than depth-based approach. You want coverage, but cover the key areas, of its application. So you don't have any major gaps. Small gaps in non-critical application, it's fine, right? So getting to that can rely on a tool, that kind of thing. Right now, there's not a very good tool out there that can do that, but I think the experience is already there, because like we do this manually or again and again with clients, and then naturally with experience we can certainly put those knowledge down and then automate that. And then organization can do the same thing as well. If you've done things enough, you can begin to form a set of questions that it's going to, hopefully it's effective in helping you to scale up in a breadth first manner. The depth part, it has to be hard effort. There's no way you can avoid it. But the breadth part, you can do a little bit of cheating. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Any questions? And so I want to find out. This topic is not typical in the sense we're doing pen testing or things like that. So I wonder what kind of interest you guys when you come to this talk, and then what do you expect, and then is there anything you try to solve that can share? Go ahead.
When I was going here, I thought you would be talking about gates, like SDLC is typically like, I was getting that CSSLP, secure certified secure software cycle.
Right.
Freshman when I studied, it was all about gates, isolation of production data and things like that, data privacy. You didn't mention any of that, so I was kind of okay.
Right.
Different perspective, I guess.
It's intentional, and actually that's a really good question. Okay, security architecture. I think about this problem think about this kind of talk since early last year. Okay, I never put down something, but back in my mind, it's been kind of seeding that. And then when I was creating this talk, I have a lot of angles I want to cover, right? But I decided against a very specific kind of practice, because I can do a talk on that as well, okay, if there's enough interest. But I would rather paint the broad picture and then get the concept down, and hopefully, I think at this point, a lot of organizations have this angst about, should I hire a security architect, and then what do they do, right? And then that's a question I've been thinking a lot as well, because I've been doing this myself all the time, and I interact with different people, and I try to make sense of it. So that's why I focus on, and then I did not focus on the gate. But yes, you're correct. From the SDLC perspective, there are various security gates, and then it's established as part of your SDLC standard, right? And then security architecture, usually it goes with other architecture review. For example, ARB, the Architecture Review Board, and all those gates are still applicable. And the only, from life cycle perspective, is really your organization, the sensitivity of the asset you want to protect, determine how strong or how loose you want the gates to be. But usually where the gates is supposed to be is pretty well defined, because the checkpoint is not much different from your regular checkpoints, like the ARB and those things, right?
From SDLC viewpoint, the other relevant question that a lot of clients have is, okay, it's one thing to do threat modeling, implement gates, but if I'm doing agile processing, how does this kind of work with agile in SDLC?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Everyone assumes that a lot of this stuff came came out when people were doing waterfall and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
No one is doing that anymore. So, and that would be interesting.
Right, right, yeah. That's also one area I thought about that. And then a third area, before I come back and then comment on that, a third area is you have various kind of security activities like pen testing, source code review, right? And then you have security architecture, and then you also, the EA side will have its own mandate as well. So all this need to come together, right? And then usually in the SDLC, you have gates to check, in the agile process, it's very interesting because in agile, some of the functional requirements come in small portion, right? So you're implementing it sprint, and architecture could be changed significantly as well along the way, right? So to do agile security architecture actually is a very tricky thing. You have to anticipate basically, and then because of usually waterfall actually is better for architecture in the sense that you have sufficient time, you have sufficient upfront work to articulate the solution architecture and everything. But in a agile environment, you have fewer input or written down input, and then so you will have to figure out what's relevant, what's not. Getting to a complete picture probably is not a good way to approach it. Okay, you will have to tune in with the agile process, but you have to anticipate ahead a little bit, because the functional boundary does not coincide with your, security protection boundary. Okay, so you need to think about. Hopefully the pipeline, the backlog allow you to look deeper into the requirement a little bit, and then you can be one step ahead. In the scope of a sprint, you can do two main things. One is you design the controls that need to be built, right? So that's one thing that's in scope for that, or build for the next sprint of functional requirement. And two is you make sure you have good coverage on the requirement itself, the current sprint requirement, right? So the same way you build pipeline backlog, and then for your sprints on the functional side, you would need to plan out pretty well and very agile about how do you build your security architecture. The attack model we actually fit pretty well with agile, because when you have a piece, conceptually you build something incrementally, but you have some shape. You can do a partial threat modeling as well, right? It's not like you have to do it in full. But what would be helpful is in the tail end of the project cycle, you need to have a gate to check on the completeness of it, right? So along the way, you break it down into sprint, you address the requirement. Remember that regardless of how you build your system in sprint or waterfall, the enterprise policy is there, the standard is there. You have to fulfill them, right? And then it's a matter of how you break them down into pieces. And then, but to do it effectively, there's a doing part, and also there's a assurance part. You want to make sure you have probably, every few sprints you have a checkpoint that's more, a little bit deeper than just, chasing the sprint kind of narrow tempo kind of thing, right? So you establish the pattern, the rhythm, and then you should be able to execute as well.
But may I comment? Because whether you have waterfall or you have short sprints, it doesn't matter. 99% of the time, you develop software not for yourself, for end customer. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you may have some security architecture for your internal environment, for your team operators, like developers, like distributed environment, maybe some messaging between, or software source code check in, check out, like Git or JIT and whatever, or Rec Pro, Rational. But when you develop the product, I think for security architecture, you need to have in mind the actual operating model, what will be used. Let's say you produce super duper new instant messaging, like Viber, Skype combined, whatever, NSA free, right? And Prism free. And I mean, your architecture, your security architecture would need to account not for the building where you develop the software or the team that uses certain tools, but for actual environment where you're going to deploy like Windows laptops or phones or Android, all those factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there should be distinction made between the architecture you apply to your in-house environment and the actual software product where it will live, the environment in which the software product will live, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Right. So that depends on the requirement, right? I mean, it's not every situation where you actually
No, in that case, I mean,
have
whether
internal
it's
applications. So
where you do sprints or
Right.
waterfall, I mean.
no, absolutely. So I think it all kind of boils back to that fundamental thing of considering the business context and requirements, and you get into the threat model.
Yeah, that's a very interesting scenario as well, because when you build a product like that and then you anticipate the user mode to be a variety of them, your threat model basically you need to cover to that. So for example, now we support iPhone client, then that is a threat model, right? And then now you support BlackBerry. Maybe it's very different, and then it could be another threat model. And then most of the time we feel like, okay, threat model or development, it's always something that we can build, but not always, right? Your client, sometimes you depend on, for example, browser client in the mobile sense, it keeps changing, right? So you need people to be in that domain to understand the technology and the security impact properly. And then, so as a team sport for security, then you need different skill set of people work together. And then, so you on the platform side, you have a threat model, but on the client side, it definitely need, potentially another more detailed threat model itself, but you need somebody with that familiar with that technology to build it properly. And so yeah, it's just a different problem, but the overall architecture approach, I don't see any difference here. Any other questions?
How do you apply this to, I mean, you talked about agile, but startups generally have a lot less, there's no documentation usually, code's getting pushed out all the time, continuous delivery, continuous deployments. What would you say is probably the most important things from this that startups who don't have usually a security team, they definitely don't have dedicated architects, what do you think are the most important parts of this that they should take away from it and try to implement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, even for startup, you know what you need to protect. Hopefully, that need to be made explicit. Okay, that's one thing. That's clear. You can say, okay, there's nothing sensitive. I'm providing a messaging platform. People just exchanging things. I use OAuth, so I don't even keep the user account. Looks like very, there's nothing you need to protect. But on the other hand, the cross-site scripting, all those things could creep in and then make life very difficult for you, right? There's third-party liability issue, right? So you still, I think the architecture, security architecture approach still is required to the extent that you identify the asset to be protected explicitly, you identify the liability explicitly, and then you articulate what is the proper controls. And then so sometimes those controls could be product features. It doesn't have to be, kind of add on to the architecture. And then sometimes it is a best practice. And I think making those explicit, it's a risk control mechanism, right? Because business people, especially, they for startup, they focus a lot more on capability functionality. They don't have, first, there may not be user using that. It's just a kind of hypothetical use case. Then you don't even know where the protection and what's the goal. So it's even more important to have the discussion and then make it explicit. Because that, from business risk perspective, I just don't see, without a security architecture, you can get around that properly.
But it is, to Mike's point, it's a realistic problem, not only in the small companies, in mid to larger companies. I guess the idea of doing a formal threat model sometimes gets cost prohibitive from a management standpoint. Mm-hmm. So in those situations, kind of a trade-off is made. You kind of risk accept, okay, it's not perfect, but then I guess they don't do a formal threat model, they just pick bits and pieces off it.
Right.
But absolutely, I think there is recognition and acceptance from the part of management as well that this isn't, they recognize that there hasn't been a formal security assessment done on that application or that infrastructure.
Right. I think the formal part has to do with organization that you want to share knowledge, reuse, and then also fulfill third-party kind of requirement, right? You want to prove that you're doing certain thing, right? From startup perspective, you can cut down a lot of those, but I think the key thing is risk management, and then you being able to articulate the risk and being able to spend the right money on the key places. I think that is key, and that is a very extremely valuable aspect if you think about that. And so the approach to security architecture is still valid. It's just the format of it, and you pretty much if you do a trial product, you anticipate major change to your architecture. You don't want to document everything to the teeth and then do everything, but you do want to know where your risks are and then what's your strategy to mitigate the risk.
And just from security architecture, what you're saying about the pattern piece too, really is if you come up with a way to do your queuing in a secure fashion, take that extra little bit of time to say, don't write a queuing mechanism that doesn't do it the way that we've already figured out and already invested that time in, right? Is that much refactoring and say, hey, we did it right once. Really, push the idea of going back to that. Even maybe that's just how you build up your pattern category, right?
Right.
One or two at a time.
Yeah.
And then just, even if you have a major upgrade, you just end up consuming those services or patterns from the catalog.
Right.
Yeah.
Another thing that allow you to do is if you have more legacy applications than building new ones, you may introduce technology that compensate based on the threat model, right? Rather than rebuild from inside out. So that could be so once you have a baseline, I think the key thing is you have a strategy, and then you can have different choices how to build it, for example. So that is very important.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.